to the cloud. You saw this and you were like, okay, but it seems like a coarse way to distinguish all of the neurons in the brains. Only type 1 and type 2, will this allow us to reach the entire categorization? Well, ultimately, you know that these were classifications that were produced in the 50s on the basis of the data that they had available back then, and the complexity of the problem has increased since then. But we started by just differentiating the neurons that integrate well their signals, and they transform current that comes into spikes, with the neurons that integrate less well, if you like. They're stiffer to modulate, and they have this bistable-like behavior in which you can't actually raise the input without the neuron producing any output. So bistability. But these two broad classes, this is what I wanted you to remember, that they kind of like are a good first step representation of what the networks can do and look like. But I showed you this bestiary and all the kinds of different spikes that neurons are able to produce, and you were justifiably wondering, so how do you relate those two-dimensional dynamics that you were telling us about in these simplified models to the spikes that they produce? And I told you that, so ultimately it's a set of 4 types of bifurcations that will explain the computational properties of most of these neuronal categories. To focus now, first and foremost, is not only the integrator and resonator categorization, is to expand it from the original simplified version to 2 more: the bistable neurons and the monostable neurons. The bistable neurons are the ones like type 2, in which you toggle activity by adding current. Instead of producing 1 spike at a time, you basically, when you put a certain a step input, a fast flick, it suddenly engages into spiking behavior. And even if you remove now that input, that spike behavior will be sustained. So the one main difference between integrator and resonator. So the integrator, if you give a step current, it will produce a couple of spikes. When you remove the step current, those spikes will be gone. In the resonator, or when you give a step current, you might toggle it on. And so you say, from this moment on, you shall be producing spikes ongoing. You've engaged in the limit cycle. The limit cycle is an attractor. You've got out of an equilibrium, which you were quiescent and happy, and now you went to another equilibrium, which is a limit cycle. So even though I gave you like only the first elements to think about, the integrator and the resonator, we do have this characteristic that is of a resonator of being bistable too. So clearly the story is not as simple as I was selling it to you. However, it's not that much more complex. And so this is what we're going to be discussing on today, like in the first part of the lecture. These are the names of the bifurcations we're talking about. There's the saddle node on invariant circle, the subcritical Andronov-Hopf, and the supercritical Andronov-Hopf bifurcation. Okay. Now, before we go there, just to give you a sense of what is the underlying, the motor of these dynamics, this is why I was sharing with you a moment ago this video on false stats. So where's Opera? I need. Seems okay. Okay. So this is a vector field. Can you see a vector field here? You've seen vector fields before in the adaptive exponential integrating fire. So one of the things that I want you to remember about phase spaces in general is that for any given point, any given combination of state variables, x and y in this case, or v and w in the case of neurons, you have a unique tendency for that state. So there's only one thing we'll do. Or maybe it's a fixed point, then it won't go anywhere. But anything it does is a combination of these two dimensions, because you have only two state variables. So ultimately, for any given point, you will have a combination of the two different dynamics on that state. The dots you see are states. Possible states in the phase space, possible combinations of x and y, possible combinations of v and w. If I let it go, you will notice that they start going round and round. So this is a spiking dynamics from the given by the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model. The equations that I put down here are the ones from the Fitzhugh-Nagumo. And these are potential values, and you see that there are not even names in the axis. I mean, you just assume that x is the horizontal, y is the vertical, because what you're interested in here are the qualitative dynamics of the system. So for instance, if I add a little bit of current here, I will have spikes that modulate their amplitudes and their bottom and top of the plots. They modulate the amplitude not only of the tip of the spike, but also of the bottom of the spike. How can I see that? So these are the Fitzhugh-Nagumo equations. And the last number that I'm changing here is the current. Okay, X stands for voltage, and it stands for current. I see this because, as I know that Y is the refractory variable and X is the voltage variable, once I add current, the spikes are going to be shifted up and down. I'm going to send you this later so that you can play with. Another way to look into this is by
Mario, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share a new thing because as you do. Okay. So this is the Fitzhugh-Nagumo model as well. Tell me. Ginny, is it you? So somehow, I don't know if it's my computer now. Am I lagging, or is it okay for you guys? Hello?
It's okay for me. I think it's Jimmy.
That his internet is really bad.
Okay, so then if you want to ask in the text, you're also welcome to. Anticlimactic. There's a question. Roll the drums. Okay.
May I ask a question in the meantime?
Can you explain the exact difference between a type 1 and type 2 neuron? Well, I just did, right? The exact difference. So there are two levels here. There's one level which is the causal level at the level of the bifurcations of the model. So we know that the difference there is that the type of bifurcations are different. And the other is the phenomenological level, in which we're talking about the difference of the activity of the neuron. Class 1 excitability has a linear relationship between current and firing frequency. And it can generate spikes with arbitrarily low frequency. These statements are also in the brain escape flashcard. The class 2 excitability has a behavior that toggles from nothing, even if you increase current, to a on behavior, so to speak. So here, this is the Fitsug-Nagumo model. And the Fitsug-Nagumo is, in certain respects, similar to the adaptive exponential that we've been playing with before. I'll get to you in a short second, Luca. So I'm hoping that Mathematica is going. Actually, maybe if I, close this one. Are you seeing this? What I'm seeing now? So it appears that my Mathematica will now crash because I'm having like a weird. Just a second. I'm going to have to quit Mathematica because it started blinking. Let's try it again. Okay, do you see what I'm saying now? Can you answer in the audio?
Can you see your screen?
Yes, you can see my screen, right? Good.
We see folders. So I don't know if that's what you're showing.
So you, on the left, you should see a string, a vector field, and on the right, you should see a time series. Colors
No.
orange and red. No?
No.
Is the window management of Mathematica. When I open when I tell Mathematica which window I'm sharing, it doesn't do it. Fantastic. Okay, so in a second.
Now we can see vector field and time series.
Yeah, now you can see this. So they can see phase space now.
Yes.
This is also anticlimactic. One of the reasons I bought a new computer recently was because I was blaming these difficulties on the processing power of my computer. But unfortunately, it's Mathematica itself. Okay, so the Fitsug-Nagumo model, these are the equations. We have V dot, which is the change of voltage as a function of time, and it changes according to this equation. Don't focus on the details, but it's a cubic with a contribution of a refractory variable, and this is the refractory variable, which is in this case a linear relationship. The adaptive exponential integrate and fire has certain aspects that are similar to this. Instead of being a cubic here, it's an adaptive. It's an exponential curve that goes up here. But I use this because it's convenient for to look into the systems here. Now, first question: do you see the Noke line just by staring at the picture? Do you see the two Noke lines? Can you answer yes or no in the chat if you do or do not? Okay, so do you know which one is the V Noke line and which one is the W Noke line? So do you see where the equilibrium is? Do you see that the equilibrium is an attractor? So the dynamics close to the equilibrium are going, so Swantje, can anyone explain to Swantje why the equilibrium is an attractor?
Well, the new milk lines from all directions point toward it, so it's going. So direction is going inside, not outside.
Yeah. So all trajectories, all orbits are landing in that fixed point. So it's an attractor because it is attracting the orbits. Now, Swantje might have answered no because she said, "But I don't know why this is a fixed point attractor. I don't know why this equilibrium is attracting." The answer is that it has to do with the vector field around the attractor. In fact, here the derivatives of the Noke lines at the equilibrium. But I don't, so that's still a place I don't necessarily want to go. So this is you can, for example, compute the eigenvectors and eigenvalues of the linearization of the system at this point. And then you will find out that you have two main directions here. You have this green direction and this orange direction, which would be the tangents to the dynamic curves, to the Noke lines. And in essence, you are bringing in the orbits because your Jacobian is smaller than 0. So ultimately, you have a contracting flow there. And the contracting flow, you can see it in the vector field. If you just follow what the lines are doing, and you now know, I mean, so the tutorial for, apologies. So the tutorial for, when I zoom in, do you see the zoom in version of what I see, or no, right? Because do you see the zoom in like this? When I zoom in on the equilibrium, maybe not, because I'm sharing only one screen at a time. Anyways, so the vector field surrounding it is going to be determined via the inequalities that the Noke lines imply. So if you've done the two-dimensional tutorial for the vector fields, you should be able to tell which are the directions of the vector fields in any of these areas that are distinguished by the intersections of the Noke lines. So here on the top, you have this area. And for all of this region here between the green Noke line and the orange Noke line, that is the W Noke line and the V Noke line, you have a flow that is going down to the left. Can you see, Swantje, that in the entire vector field in that region is pointing down left? And Sue, can you see? Because if you can see that, then you can also see that on this other region here where my cursor is, and I hope that you can see my cursor. Can you see the pointer of my mouse? If you can see the pointer of my mouse, you'll know that I'm pointing to the region just to the left and down. And at that level, at that area, the vector field has inverted direction. So it's no longer going to the left, that is, it's no longer reducing voltage, but now it's increasing voltage. It means you're under the resting potential. You're going back to resting potential, but now the current flow is positive. And so you're increasing voltage of that model. But simultaneously, you're going down on the refractory variable. That is, you're becoming more and more likely to spike. You have more and more sodium deactivated channels. These are perfect and ready to fire. That's why actually we use the cubic to represent that. In the bottom right, you have the flow that points up. And when you cross the V Noke line, you again have the flow that points left, so to decrease the voltage, but increasing refractory. Ultimately, this is what you're reading when you're trying to find out whether something is an attractor or not. So what are going to be the trajectories for any point in phase space? You're just going to have to follow the vector field for any little point, and you will see that the tendency for all of the trajectories is that attractor over there. That's why it's an attractor. To make it a repeller, there's a couple of ways. You would have to, for one of the things you could do is make it shift such that the derivative at that point on the v direction ceases to be smaller than 0. And even though the entire flow is similar, now this equilibrium is no longer an attracting equilibrium, it's a repelling equilibrium. And even more so, it's actually a saddle node. It's attracting in one direction and repelling in the other direction. That's what creates this expulsion from this point on. Notice what happens if I lowered the current. Suddenly, the spiking region has started pulling and expelling it from it. So what's changing there is the Jacobian. What is changing there is the derivative, the local derivative at that point, and particularly in one direction. It's creating a saddle node. That means the neuron is no longer happy to be in resting potential. It is likely, we're adding current, so we have removed that resting state at the bottom of we have removed the resting state. And so the sodium channels now can work regeneratively and in the positive feedback. How do you determine the direction of the vector field? Watch the tutorial on two-dimensional ones. Have you watched it, Micah? So if you watched it, you should know. So yeah, then you do not know. I mean, so but you basically, these are inequalities, no? So the VW dots and the W dots, yeah, on canvas. So I could give a fast tutorial, but I think it's better. You better just go watch the videos, 5 minutes, and it will tell you exactly how to determine the direction of the null lines. Determining the derivatives at the fixed point is a matter of the slope of the null line. So the slope of the green null line is not changing, but the slope of the orange null line there at the fixed point is changing. So here we have a small scope, a small slope in the null line, and when it gets smaller than 0, when the null line direction starts to be negative, yeah. So other modules under video lectures, and the slope inverts direction. So you notice that you're passing through the bottom of the cubic curve, and that's actually what's determining it. That determines the change of one of the directions of the attractor. So it was an attractor that was attracting in both directions, and now suddenly it starts repelling from the voltage direction. And it repels because you have more current. So basically, you read the creation of the limit cycle as I no longer have a resting state to live in. The slope of the green line hasn't changed. So the eigenvector at the green line hasn't changed. These words. If you really care, then you can go there. I have put now, I wanted to actually share with you the Scholarpedia page for the adaptive exponential model, and you can learn more about the eigenvectors and eigenvalues and the computation of the Jacobian. In fact, you can do that the same thing in the advanced neurodynamics part of our project, number 2. We discuss these aspects, like the changes of stability there. Thank you, Natya. Okay. Now, there are more things you can do here. If I change now not the baseline level of the V nuclide by adding and removing current, but I now change the slope of the refractory variable. That means I'm making the refractory variable slower. If I make the refractory variable sufficiently slow, I have now 3 points of intersection between the nucline, the green nucline, and the orange nucline. And each of these points of intersection, as you know, are points where both of the nuclines are 0, so they're each equilibria. Now, it just so happens that the equilibria here in the middle is a very unstable equilibrium. In fact, it is the same saddle node as we had before. It is pushing orbits away from it because the nuclines ultimately have an intersection with a high slope, so larger than 0, the derivative. And it distinguishes 2 points that the neuron can happily occupy. So these are 2 stable equilibria. And actually, this looks like what in neurophysiology is called the depolarization block. A depolarization block is the case where you have all of the sodium channels activated, but so they've been all open, but you continue injecting current until all of the inactivation gates close. So basically, you keep the depolarized state over time then. And even if you change a little bit the voltage, look, I mean, like if I change the this initial state here, for a variety of initial states, for a variety of perturbations, for a variety of little voltage flicks I can give, you know, by potentially injecting a bit current going up and down, it will go to the depolarized state. And for a variety of other ones that are actually even for some that have the same voltage, just the only thing that changes is the refractory variable, it will go to the hyperpolarized equilibrium, the one that in the voltage here in the horizontal line is going to the left. The reason why I'm showing you this is because I wanted to get a sense for all of the kinds of things that can happen when you have 2 curves intersecting in phase space. These 2 curves fully determine every single possible equilibrium in the system, and they have interpretations that go back to the channel activations. Now, keep this picture in mind, okay? Keep this picture in mind. The idea is that these equilibria are changing the slopes, and by changing the slopes, they become either attracting or saddle nodes or in fact repellers, and depending on what they are, they're going to send the trajectories away from them. And if they're sending them away from them and they cannot return, then you have an ongoing spiking process. So ultimately, now I want to, so this is a slightly different model. The W no line here is no longer a line, but I wanted to use it to explain the spiking generation procedure without changing the neuron, okay? So without actually doing anything with the main parameters of the neuron, you produce the spike. Look at the top left graph first. You notice that we have two trajectories marked with numbers 1 and 2. And you have two, you have letters indicating here A, B, C, D, E. Those are places where the NOC lines are crossing and the trajectory is crossing the NOC lines and therefore inverting the direction of the field. When we take the state from E to A, what would that mean? It's like what the operation in the neuron that takes E to A is a voltage injection, a little voltage flick. So basically, say you have two neurons connected and one neuron produced a synapse. It produces a synapse, it injects a tiny bit of current, but it's very fast. It's maybe 1 millisecond. And it moves the state towards this new place here without changing the refractory variable, just the voltage that changed. At that moment, you're no longer attracted to the resting potential. If you go all the way to A and you produce an entire spike because you're all, your flow field already in the regenerative sodium region. But if you give it a small flick that is just to the left of A, if your synapse was insufficient to trigger the all or none spike, you actually go back to the resting state. Without changing the neuron, without changing its parameters, the only thing that you've done is to change to give a voltage flick. And here on the right top plot, you see the time series relating to that, in which A, B, C, D, E is basically the full-fledged spike. And 1 is that subthreshold little oscillation thingy that is not quite a spike, right? Now, if you raise the entire current for the neuron, and that you see in panel A in the bottom left, that attracting state is no longer attracting, as I just showed you when you raise the voltage in the Fitz-Nagumo model, and you have the emergence of the limit cycle, because that is no longer an attracting fixed point. So it was an attracting fixed point, it ceases to be an attracting fixed point. Now, one more trick. The right bottom plot. This is a bifurcation diagram. You have a current in the bottom, and you have voltage on top. On the y-axis, so current against voltage. Now what you notice here is that as you start with a neuron at 70 millivolts, and you start slowly raising the voltage, slowly rising, slowly rising. If you start slowly rising the current, the voltage slowly rises together, because ultimately voltage is a function of current, as you remember, also in Hodgkin-Wright-Lee, and sort of linearly, up until a point when, so this line, this continuous line here, up until C, from A to C, is where the fixed point is. And the fixed point only exists if the two NOC lines are crossing. If no NOC lines cease to cross, or if the NOC lines, if the equilibrium loses stability, you have this dotted line here, which is the moment from which the equilibrium is no longer attracting, is no longer stable. And when the equilibrium no longer exists, you have these two lines, one on top and one on the bottom here. They actually represent the oscillation of the limit cycle. So you're basically taking the maximum and the minimum of the limit cycle as you're having ongoing spikes. So you no longer have that resting state. You now have an attracting limit cycle, and when you plot the minimum and the maximum of that for, say here, for this amount of current, 90 millivolts, you only have spiking. Now there's a region between more or less around 90 millivolts where you have the coexistence of two types of attractors. One, the spiking limit cycle, and two, the resting attracting fixed point. So here in the middle line, so you see this sort of like umbrella shape. You have like this line coming in continuously here, and you have this involuted part that is basically the unstable limit cycle, those dashed lines. But let's not go there. The point here is that if you perturb the membrane potential, if you perturb the membrane potential, you're basically changing the position of the state in the vertical line. And if you go over this dashed line here, you jump to the limit cycle. So you go over an unstable limit cycle and over to the stable limit cycle and start producing spikes. Now we're looking at the spikes here from different projections. So this is a projection at the voltage space only against current. But you should be imagining that you're actually changing this in the two-dimensional space by introducing current and by shifting up and down the V-no line. Exercise is needed to really get to this, but I wanted to continue giving you the sense of what are the kinds of things that can happen.
Can I ask a quick question? Yeah. Yeah, in this slide. So basically, if we have injection of current that is just short term, just a few milliseconds, then we are in the case where we move the state like from left to right or the other way around, like in the first case. But if we have a constant injection of current, then we are shifting the V-null line, right?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thanks.
So the difference is, yeah, as you point out, I'm just going to say once again, because it's important and it's an insight. When you add current constantly, you're adding a number to the V-null line, which basically makes it shift up and down. If you, however, get a little synapse, maybe a voltage flick in the amplifier, then you're not influencing the position of the V-null line itself. You're only influencing the state variable. So when you're changing the current, you're changing a parameter of the entire system. When you're flicking the voltage, you're just perturbing, is the technical word, you're perturbing the state. And this is actually the essence to understand where these states can co-occur and to understand the kinds of spiking that are available to different neurons, because the different parameters will change the conformations of the nucleus. So the nucleus shapes are going to be a function of the parameters. And so the equilibria are going to be a function of the parameters. And so that's what the neuron is. Basically, it's not changing super fast, like within the scale of minutes, the neuron is probably more or less the same. And because it's more or less the same, the equilibria are more or less in the same places. That's why it produces similar spikes to itself. So that's why we can distinguish neurons when we're recording electrophysiology as a function of their spike shape, because their spike shape is constant over time. And it's constant over time because primarily the parameters either are kept or are kept such that the spike retains the same shape. Now here we have 4 different phase portraits, 4 different kinds of spikes ultimately. And this is then what was distinguishing in that table the integrators from the resonators and the monostable from the bistable neurons. So here in the saddle node bifurcation, you have, imagine here that So see, like here, they're not even plotting any longer the null lines. You're just saying, okay, your stable equilibrium is in red. Oh, in red. Red is a good word color for black. So the stable equilibrium is in black, where my cursor is pointing, and the saddle node is in white. So the only thing that is displayed in this diagram is the crossing of the null lines. Okay, so no longer the entire null line, just the crossing. And here you see that you have in the, okay, so to the left of that resting state here, the black dot, you would have inhibition. An inhibitory synapse would flick the voltage towards the negative, right? And if it flicks to the negative, it would return to the resting position from the left side of it. You following me? Now, if we give an excitatory bump and an excitatory flick, for small excitatory flicks, it will return to the resting position. But if you give a sufficiently large impulse, a sufficiently large perturbation, you will cross the saddle node completely and will engage on a limit cycle attractor. So by producing a single spike, you trigger the neuron on, and this neuron cannot produce hyperpolarization related spikes. Is it clear to you that it cannot? If you hyperpolarize this neuron, it will always return to the all attracting fixed point stable equilibrium black. And if you give it a sufficient flick, he will engage on a limit cycle. Now, this is a situation that is slightly different than the right situation here, which is the saddle node on invariant cycle bifurcation, in which you still have that little thing with the inhibition. So if you give an inhibition flick to the left, nothing happens. And if you give an excitatory flick to the right that is too small, it goes back to resting. If you give a sufficiently large impulse, it will follow this trajectory here, which is a spike, but it will land in the resting state. So even if you inject a substantial amount of current, it will only produce one spike. That's sometimes people call this the class 3 neuron. I didn't want to tell you this, but yeah. So the class 3 neuron is the neuron that no matter what current you put in, it only produces one spike. That's actually, and you can see that these statements in language, they don't quite cover what the phase spaces can tell you, because the phase spaces can tell you that if you actually continue pumping up current, eventually you will change the parameters of these neurons and you will create other bifurcations. So the phase portrait is a richer way to look into what kinds of spiking there are by summarizing the ion channel exchanges and interchanges. So they're synergies, if you like. On the left side, yeah.
I have a question. So I understand how we go into the limit cycle, but how does a neuron come out of the limit cycle?
Either with an inhibitory flick, it could go. So on the saddle node bifurcation, you would come out of the limit cycle by perturbing it sufficiently with an inhibition during the spiking cycle, for example, or preferably when it's close to the bottom. So whatever makes you cross the node line and get in the basin of attraction, which is basically the region in phase space that attracts the orbits of the inhibitory neuron, or the of the stable fixed point, it would cause it to flick back to non-spiking mode.
So if if we get the neuron into the limit cycle and we don't do anything, it will spike and spike and spike.
And that's what so that's a biphasic neuron that is a resonator type. It produces ongoing spikes after a certain amount of current, and it doesn't stop, and it doesn't really care that you put more current or less current. For a variety of perturbations, you will come back to the same. This is what you actually saw in the Fitsugma-Guma model. For any initial state I was going to put in, he was returning into the limit cycle, if you remember. Do you?
Yeah, thank you for the answer.
Yeah, so here then if I, that's too much. I just want one crossing. So when we have only one crossing and we have sufficient current, we engage on the limit cycle. And this is the limit cycle. And you see here, no matter what you do, you don't find yourself in this equilibrium because it is not an equilibrium. Look at what you can see here in the Wolfram again. This is, so what's the threshold kind of question? If you notice, the perturbation that I gave to the neuron is such that it's very small. So the initial condition is very close to the equilibrium. Can you see that? So the crosshair that determines the perturbation that I've injected in my neuron is ultra close to the equilibrium. But because it's a repeller in that direction, because it's pushing away the V action, so because the derivative in V is very positive there, it will actually start to oscillate out of control and grow and every single cycle is growing in amplitude a little bit and will produce a spike much later. So it explains the absence of or obvious threshold. Even as a flick of very small amplitude will produce a spike farther down in the future. So, maybe your experiment is only recording spikes within 500 milliseconds and you produce one at 600 and you say, oh, that's no longer because of the perturbation of the plaque. Well, actually it still is. So just to give you a sense of the category in which this neuron falls, we will go back to the bestiary. So let's see here, the spike latency. So this is the I variable that we were talking about here. So in a saddle node bifurcation, you can see spikes with long latency. There are two more bifurcations. There is the subcritical Andronov-Hopf and the supercritical Andronov-Hopf. Now, you've learned about the fact that there are stable limit cycles. What you didn't know up until now is that there are also unstable limit cycles. And that's the Hopf bifurcation. We would need an entire in my dynamical systems course, devote 2 lectures to the Hopf bifurcation. So we're not going to go all the way there. But I want to let you know that there are unstable limit cycles as well. And in this case, they're represented by this dotted line in phase space. In the case of the subcritical Andronov-Hopf bifurcation, you also have the toggling behavior between spiking and non-spiking. For small perturbations around the fixed point, you have that the neuron returns to quiescent mode. If you have a sufficiently large perturbation, you get a trajectory de-engaged into the spiking limit cycle attractor. In order to stop that spiking procedure, Natia and others, as you might have thought about this, you have to produce a perturbation at the right time. So here's how you stop a neuron that is spiking and that has a subcritical Hopf bifurcation. When it's going, so when the neuron is going back to refractory, when the neuron is going back down, you have to give it a positive voltage flick. That's funny. So when instead, you're thinking that you're going to refractory period and you're basically spiking tonically. You're going back to refractory, so you're happy there. What's going to happen? What's the worst can happen? Well, if you give a positive deflection frequency here where you see, so like can you see my cursor? You haven't answered yet. So like, can you see my cursor? Like, just tell me, because I don't have,
Yes.
okay, thank you, Elena. So if you see here and you produce a postsynaptic voltage here, a flick, and you cross the unstable limit cycle, you get back to resting. That's very interesting. That's actually a prediction. People didn't know that. So the neuron is incredibly phase dependent. It so happens that if you, at the right time, and if you know what the time is, you say, little depolarization, stop neuron. So you toggle it on and off. And you toggle it off if you produce a perturbation with appropriate timing. Fun, no? And then you have the supercritical Andronov-Hoff bifurcation, in which you have the production of spikes with any type of, with any amplitude. It also has a limit cycle, but this limit cycle now varies smoothly in amplitude with the with injected current and other parameters. It has a resting state, but it no longer has the unstable limit cycle that you can cross. Funny thing about the subcritical bifurcation, it happens also in mechanical systems, like sometimes vibrating, oscillating systems like cars or energy power plants. And they're very scary because they are the ones in which, you have a vibration and it seems like your pump or whatever mechanical equipment you have, it's kind of like it's vibrating, but it's happy, it doesn't vibrate out of bounds. Now, there is a very sensitive spot there. If it vibrates just a little bit more than that amount, it starts to vibrate with enormous oscillations. That's when, things go boom, ultimately. And that's also the analogy. The spike goes boom. And so suddenly it starts a small vibration, but it can go with a very large vibration very quickly. So it becomes very reactive. This is why we use the word critical to neurons. So there's a subcritical bifurcation in this case because it's under the critical point. If you change the parameters, so I told you how each neurons, so in this plot, each of the 4 plots, the neurons are fully parameterized and you're not changing their parameters. A, B, C, D, I, everybody stays the same. The only thing you're changing is the state. In this plot, you have changes of parameters. That is, the neuron is now changing inside. So it is expressing new protein. It is absorbing new ion channels. In that case, it's getting substantial current. In those cases, you see changes of the equilibria, so bifurcations, really. And the first bifurcation is the saddle node bifurcation. The saddle node bifurcation happens when you have a node, which is an attractor, when it's a stable equilibrium, fusing together and merging with the saddle node, which was attracting from one direction and pushing the other direction. And suddenly, when they come together, they poof, disappear. I want to show you what is a saddle node. And I know it's already 10:10. But bear with me because I think that you might find this enlightening. Quick time. Player. New share. Now I have to share quick time. Okay. Yeah. So Luca, I'm going to get to you in a moment. And by the way, everybody, you're welcome to just jump in with a hand as well in the participants list, or even talk as I'm talking. Let's talk about the one-dimensional system. You remember the one-dimensional systems we discussed before? So here, this is a one-dimensional system, and we're going to be talking about them when we talk about the leaky integrated fires in a second. We have a one-dimensional system that here, this is, if you remember, V dot is dV over dt. Now let's assume for a second that the dynamics of is given by this parabola here. And it has an additive parameter B that determines how far it is from zero. Right now, the states of the system, any place where you would start, you would progress to the right side. Slower here and then faster here, okay? It's clear to everybody? And if we now have the B parameter of our parabola, B is now equal to 0, it is knocking on that curve. So that states to the left of the parabola will come here, and states to the right of the parabola will come here. This guy here is now a saddle node because it's attracting from one side and repelling from the other side. If now the parabola continues to go down, the stable part of the attractor goes to the left and the unstable part of the attractor goes to the right. So basically you had a split of the saddle node. So same thing as we just saw in the plot in the keynote. You had a stable attractor and unstable attractor. They come together, they become a saddle node, and then they poof, vanish in space. So vanished, there's no attractor. And here, you know, first saddle, and then attractor and repeller. Yeah, cool. All right. So as you're undergoing these bifurcations, and so you can see here in the slide later with utmost calm what is happening at each of them. Here in the saddle node of invariant circle, you also had a saddle node bifurcation, but it's actually happening in the limit cycle. It's not that hard to make a situation like B. The C would be a subcritical Andronov-Hopf bifurcation, and D would be a supercritical Andronov-Hopf bifurcation in which you have the emergence of a stable limit cycle. And so,
could you explain the difference between sub and supercritical Andronov-Hopf again?
So once again, the subcritical bifurcation has the emergence of an unstable limit cycle, that is this dashed line here. The supercritical has the emergence of a stable limit cycle. So in the supercritical, you start from a fixed point and it goes like grows, 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 grows. It's always a limit cycle. And so you can have any little amplitude depending on the diameter of this limit cycle. Whereas in the subcritical, you have the stable attractor under an unstable limit cycle. So that one can toggle. This one has a bistable behavior because it can be stable here, happy, and stable here in the limit cycle, happy. as you make the unstable limit cycle disappear, it's no longer bistable, right?
And do we make it disappear by injecting persistent current? Like, what is in this slide different?
Yeah, I mean, so there are many. So the truth of the matter is that there are multiple ways to do this. You have to change the basically all the ways in which you can change the equilibria that would bring this bifurcation are possible ways. And this is why Eve Marder is right when she's saying there's pick and match parameters to find specific spiking patterns. There are multiple ways in which you can change to produce the same phase portraits. The phase portrait is there is a many-to-one relationship between current and parameters to these phase portraits. That was Sue, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So yes, this is clear, Sue. So the entire idea here is that there is no one-to-one relationship, and that's why it's not exactly easy to know what you need to change. And I don't want you to think about it in those terms. I want you to think about it in terms, I'm changing the relationships between those variables. I'm creating new attracting domains in these regions. I am basically slicing and the phase space with new vector field domains. So to get an understanding of how to produce each of these, you can either go to the Zhikevich book or to the first paper in the ADEX project. I've now added a paper on Scholarpedia, and that was the last thing I wanted to show you today. So sometimes the saddle node can be, so in fact, Luca, a slip of the tongue. In the phase space, these are the one bifurcations that you should search for. So integrators are saddle nodes, clearly not resonators, because they're the ones in which when you're pushing current, they're having happier and happier limit cycles. The limit cycles have different amplitudes as you push them up with the current. So that's why. And saddle nodes on invariant circles will, they will go from bistable to monostable. The bifurcation is actually a separatrix. So to have the full-fledged view of 4 types of spiking neurons given static parameterization types, you would be covered by this little matrix here. So they can be resonators and integrators and stable, monostable and bistable. I want to know from you guys if you can understand monostable and bistable, like if everybody now, so do you feel confident about the difference between monostable and bistable? Because if you do, and also resonators and integrators, this is the time for questions. It's 1 hour, 20 minutes now that we've already talking about this, or 1 hour.
I had a follow-up question to the question that I asked in the chat.
Yes, please.
So why is the supercritical Andronov-Hope bifurcation considered a resonator? Because we saw that they actually change behavior constantly. The amplitude of the action potential changes.
Well, yeah, they change the amplitude, but not the frequency.
Oh, okay.
So another aspect that we're not discussing here is the frequencies of these limit cycles, because obviously as the spike is going around in phase space, it is changing the speed with which it's going also depending on the parameters. Okay. And that's actually what's changing also the frequency. It's the strength of the vector field. So basically a multiplier at the level of the vector field itself. We haven't discussed it.
I also remember from the previous lecture that we said resonators were bistable, but integrators were not.
Well, yeah, in general, I was getting from memory in terms of the neurons that we observe in, say, in the inferior olive and cerebellum. So this was a more of a, I have experience in neurons and I tell you this, but it was not supposed to cover the entire phenomenology. I didn't tell you a lie because in general it's true. So, you know, you see a lot of supercritical type Andronov-Hopf bifurcations out there. And those are resonators that are bistable.
And can I ask about the difference between bistable and monostable? So if
Who's
I,
asking?
it's always Luca here.
Okay.
So bistable means that there is a certain threshold that changes whether we're going to have a certain type of action potential or if it's going to stay around.
Bistable, yeah, like the definition is that two stable states can coexist within the same phase space without changing parameter sets. So without changing the parameters, you have two resting states. Could be two attracting fixed points, like I showed you in the Fitsugnagomo before, where you can go to a depolarized state and a hyperpolarized state, and they will be happy there, stable.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also be a resting state and a limit cycle. And in fact, it could be two limit cycles in different places. And it could be more limit cycles. I mean, the kinds of things that you can do with your mind, if you're thinking about phase spaces, can I have like two rotating circles like that? Or if you can imagine two, you know, something that happens in fluid dynamics, then it probably happens in flows. So you can have two stable vortices, and you can have two stable sinks, just simply that are attracting all points. So bistable means coexistence of resting states. So if it is not bistable, it means that there's only one equilibrium, or only one resting equilibrium. And those are the words that we usually use to describe the neurons in electrophysiology when we go, oh, so this neuron is bistable. Oh, this neuron is, you know, integrating. This neuron is toggling. You know, people sometimes talk about switching behaviors. Oh, this neuron is very stiff. So these are the words that we apply to measurement that then have a mapping onto these dynamical phenomena.
How would we guess by bistability or monostability from spiking behavior if we're not looking at the phase?
So ultimately, like the protocols that you apply in the neuron are step current protocols. If you hyperpolarize a neuron and you release and it starts producing a spike, that might be a saddle nodal invariant circle. That might also be a resonator. If you hyperpolarize the neuron and start spiking, so actually I'm going too fast. So if you hyperpolarize a neuron and it stops doing anything, and you depolarize a neuron and then you stop that depolarization, you basically apply a current step and you toggle it on, that's then bistable. So because the neurons, when they are in the Petri dish, they sometimes are active by themselves, right? And they're active by themselves, and you know, you don't need to inject any current. Then suddenly you produce a little bit of a perturbation. Actually, it could even be a physical perturbation. You clap close to the Petri dish, they will stop firing. And then, you know, experimentalist looks at them and says, like, I didn't do anything. Did I lose my cell? Did it die? No, it didn't die. It is just a bistable neuron. If you clap again, it might actually start again. Small perturbations could toggle it from the two resting states. Does this answer your question? So basically, you could have an experimental protocol in which you clap to your neurons.
Yeah, so it's trial by trial. We see how it reacts to the.
Trial by trial. So you produce a trial with hyperpolarization and one with a depolarization in a sequence, and then you see if you can toggle the bistable behavior. Clearly, when you have a neuron in your Petri dish, you have to play with the current step parameters.
Yeah, that answers it. Thank you.
And so this is kind of like, so when you asked the other question, Natya, this is the mindset I had when I answered it. You know, bistable resonators and monostable integrators. So those are the two canonical class 1 and class 2, if you like. But this is where I got this one from. Now you have the entire story, I think, or at least you can grapple with the entire story. Before we go for coffee, I wanted to quickly bring you to Opera and to this page here, because if you want to know more about all of these spiking types, the best way is to study the specific types of models. We talked about the Fitsug-Nagomo. I didn't talk so much about the quadratic integrating fire, which is the Zhikevich type neuron. There's the Wilson-Cohen models. There's the Hodgkin-Huxley model. All of them have specific bifurcation patterns that are related to their parameter interplays that change their phase portraits. These analyses exist in the literature. And one of the places that I sometimes go to when I want to learn more about a particular neuronal type is this page here, Adaptive Exponential Integrating Fire Model in Scholarpedia. This is a peer-reviewed Wikipedia, more scientifically related. Actually, the main editor is Eugene Zhikevich, who was the inventor of the quadratic exponential integrating fire and one of the great educators in neurodynamics. So in fact, I'm actually even curious if nowadays, I don't know if he actually calls his neuron, because it's his name, so he's given neuron. I don't know if it's actually here. So this is humility for you. He invented one of the most used neurons in computational neuroscience, and we don't find a model by his name in his encyclopedia. Okay, I did not know that. I find that amusing. In any case, you look at the adaptive exponential integrating fire. If you notice, we also have the advanced neurodynamics part in the adaptive exponential project we had before, and at the top I give two, which I think are very useful links. The level that we're going to be requiring you to understand these are going to be summarized in the Brainscape, and we are going to be curating it not to have too hard questions. For instance, I'm not going to ask you what's a subcritical Hopf bifurcation.